good morning and good day, I hope for you, hopefully for all of you. I'm very happy to be here, especially as we address the issues of diversity. And I think that there is no more challenging a time to deal with this issue in a very serious and sober manner than now that we have gone through the ultimate transition from an age of Obama to an age of Trump. I think that if anything, whatever your views are politically, which I will not get into, if anything contrasts more and shows the challenges of why we must deal with diversity in a real serious manner, top to bottom, I think that contrast shows what I'm talking about. Why do I say that? Much of my work over the last few decades have been in the area of criminal justice. What I have come to learn is that many people do not understand that how you view criminal justice is basically coming from where your worldview is shaped and your cultural and ethnic and religious background may be. So some people grow up viewing law enforcement one way, others grow up viewing law enforcement another way, based on their environment, based on their how they grew up, where they grew up, and what the positioning was of law enforcement. Or the same with education, or the same with any number of things, including health care. Rather than blame the person on either side for their worldview, if we began having more diversity and common ground experiences, we would understand each other's worldview. And one of the challenges that I think that we've had and been very hypocritical about in the Northeast is that there was less diverse conversations, interactions, than there were that we projected. For example, I was telling an interviewer that in the 1980s, late 1980s, I went and led marches in Howard Beach because a young black man named Michael Griffith was chased to his death because people said he didn't belong in the neighborhood. He was in a car broke down 1986. He and two friends went to a local pizzeria, asked where they could get help. They said, "What are you doing here? No ends allowed." The neighborhood chased him on the Belt Parkway, and a car ran over him. He was killed. People said, well, it wasn't necessarily race. Those of us that grew up in Brooklyn said, yeah, we knew better than to go to Howard Beach. Said it was race. They said it wasn't. So I said, fine, and I called the motorcade to go to Howard Beach of blacks to show what the reaction would be. I had a technical problem because when I called the motorcade, I didn't even own a car, but I called it anyway. Union leader called me and said, Reverend, we like the idea of a motorcade. Can my guys follow you out? I said, yeah, if I can get a ride with one of your guys. So that's how the famous Howard Beach motorcade started. I had to hustle a ride. But anyway, that's a side note. Don't give that to page 6 or whatever. So we get out to Howard Beach, and we get out the cars, and we walk to the pizzeria. And there was about 150 of us. But there were 300 whites in the surrounding streets screaming, ends go home, ends go home. Now, from my vantage point, we confronted and proved it was a racial incident. To their vantage point, we were invading the neighborhood and indicting the neighborhood. To the media's vantage point, I was a troublemaker. All of it was based on none of us really had ever talked to each other. We talked at each other, and that shaped a lot of the racial landscape of that issue. The same happened later in Bensonhurst section of Brooklyn, on and on and on. And I argue it happens today. We had 3 cases. around the country just last week. The case in Louisiana, where a young man had been killed in a car, FaceTime live by his girlfriend, Philando Castile. Policeman told him, get your ID. He reaches, he says, I have a licensed gun. Policeman shoots him 7 times, acquitted. Another policeman hung jury in Cincinnati. University of Cincinnati policeman hung jury on the killing of Samuel DuBose. Another case in Milwaukee. How the reactions was based on how you view law enforcement. What is interesting is that in 2017, you have guys like me out here that advocate in terms of some of the social justice issues. You have a president that says, I'm going to be loyal to the police. And in many ways, he and I grew up in the same New York on different sides of the barricade. Because I said to Donald Trump that I wonder if you, who lived not too far from Howard Beach, ever was on our side or the other side of the barricade. Because we act like the civil rights challenges was only down south, when in fact they were up north. One of the reasons guys like me became as controversial as Bertha Lewis is because she just walked in, you know. I know how to name drop and get my audience with me, you know, all that. So one of the reasons we became controversial is it was fashionable to challenge racism in the South. That's them down there. That's Archie Bunker. That's the guys with the overalls and the, but don't, New York is a melting pot. It's the great metropolis. What are you talking about? How dare you, Sharpton or Bertha, talk about racism in New York? So we become controversial for doing the same thing that people in the South were applauded for doing. Because if you ask people, well, why is Al Sharpton controversial? Why is Bertha? Why are they controversial? Well, they talk about racism in New York, and they all know racism in New York. Really? So if you look at the data, income level, unemployment level, education level, law enforcement, we proved it with stop and frisk. If you look at contracts, if you look at in pension fund investment, who are the money managers, across the board, I can show you southern states that do far better than New York. I'm talking about this morning. So to confront it makes you controversial, but to not confront it makes you conform to a status quo that has not really dealt with the issues of diversity. When I was a student in Tilden High School, they had what they called a group called the Panel of Americans. And the idea was that they would get one of each ethnic group and would tour the schools, and we talk about our different backgrounds, and we got to know each other. The idea was to try to bring young people together in the end of the 60s. I became a freshman until in 68. In 71, I think they started Panel of Americans. I'm still convinced they started it because they got those of us that were causing the marches and the riots in our schools off campus so we could tour the school. We got all A's for one semester because all we did was Panel of Americans and we didn't go to school. And I was a troublemaker at Tilden. My principal used to call my mother every morning to see how I was feeling and know whether we was having school that day. Because if I felt bad, we just call a boycott. So the thing, though, that I learned in Panel of Americans is that people on the other side of the political argument really had no idea of the world in which I lived, I came from, and I took as the natural world. And that I had no idea of their world. And the reason why what you're doing is so important is that we may always debate on the answers, but we need to understand who's in the conversation. So to have greater diversity in the private sector and the public sector is to come to a greater understanding that will lead to greater solutions and greater answers to problems that may not be as diametrically opposed as we thought, is that we come from such different vantage points that we don't know how we find common ground.